So good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the public programs producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so excited to welcome you to our Story Survive program about the tennis champion who escaped the Nazis. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope you'll visit the museum in person if you are able to see our current exhibitions and join us in October for the opening of Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. You can learn more on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Felice Hardy and Michael Eberstadt. Felice is a journalist and author. As a travel writer, she has toured the world for a variety of publications, including The Guardian, Telegraph, Condé Nast Traveler, and British Airways High Life magazine. She also hosts the podcast Action Packed Travel. Michael is a born and raised New Yorker. His father, Walter, was a German Jew whose immediate family emigrated to England before the war, and his mother, Vera, was a Viennese Jew who fled Austria with her mother just before the Anschluss. He is currently in the restaurant business as a partner in Charles Pan Fried Chicken, and is also an aspiring playwright whose current play tells the story of 5 generations of Jewish women. So I want to thank both of you so much for joining us today, and also to everyone in the audience for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Felice and Michael. Thank you so much.
Sydney, thank you so much for that introduction. And let me just start off by saying, Felice, congratulations on writing a fascinating book. As with all Holocaust books, it's super sad, but at the same time, it's fascinating, and I found it very, very readable. And that was actually my first question that I wanted to talk with you about before we dive into the book and the history of the book. That literary technique that you use is to create conversations throughout. Obviously, you were not present for those conversations, but I was just hoping you could talk a little bit about why you chose to do that and how you think that it helps with the narrative of the book.
Hi, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. It's great to be here. My book, which I started researching in 2015, first of all, was going to be a book just for my family. And it was going to be more of a history book so that they knew what had happened to their ancestors. But then I thought, actually, the sort of book I like to read is more of a novel. So although this is sticking to the truth, I think I'm going to introduce some dialogue to make it more readable. So that's what I did.
Right. Well, I think it was a super choice because, like I said, it was there's a ton of history, which we're going to get into now, but I also found it super readable. So the main character is your grandmother, Liesl, the tennis player. And then also the other 2 important characters, or most important characters, I think, are her husband, David, and then their daughter, Orly, who's your mother. And I definitely want to get to talking about the 3 of them, but I thought that we could, if you could please set the stage by going back 1 generation further so that you could tell us about David, her husband's family, where they were from, what they did for a living, how they grew up, and then the same on Liesl's side so that we get a sense of what the generation was before Liesl.
Okay, well, Liesl, I'll start with Liesl. She came from a well-to-do family who lived in a place called Jägendorf, which was a small town in what is today the Czech Republic. In those days, it was part of the Austrian Empire. And her father had a distillery making liqueurs, and they were very, very popular. And in fact, he sold them to King Edward VII in Britain, and also to the Kaiser. In around Austria and Germany, it was very, very popular. So she grew up with one of 3 sisters. She was the youngest, and she had a very good life. She was well educated. She went to school, and she also had a tutor for extra, sort of to learn a bit of English, bit of French, bit of Italian. She learned the piano. So all in all, she had a good life. My grandfather, on the other hand, David, he was born in what is today Slovakia. And that place was kept on changing its borders. It was a place called Podolinek, which is in the Tatras Mountains. And when he was born, it was part of Hungary. And then it later changed its borders. I think it became Slovakia. It's on the border of all sorts of different places. So language was quite fluid, really, but mainly he spoke German. So his family was very poor. He was one of 11 kids, and his father had a small farm, and he was also a cantor in the synagogue, and he, didn't have not much money to go around. So at the age of 15, David had to leave school and go. He was supposed to go and work in the sawmill, which was where all the local boys went, but he didn't like the idea of that. He thought he'd go to Vienna and seek his fortune. He already had two brothers who lived there. One of them was a butcher, and the other one was just starting out in the clothing trade. So he thought he'd go there, and he was offered a place to stay by his butcher brother. And so basically the two people came from very, very different backgrounds, and you'd think they might never have met. But it's quite into the story, you'll find out how they meet. But they meet in Paris in the Louvre Museum. And what they had in common when they met, from their very different backgrounds, was, of course, their Jewish religion. So, and they both spoke German as well.
And so David's family was a pretty religious family, as opposed to Liesl's, which was not. Is that
That's right.
fair?
Yeah, Liesl's family was not, they followed the holidays, and they went to synagogue for that sort of thing, but not really very religious. And Liesl herself was not religious, whereas my grandfather David was.
Mm-hmm. And getting to sort of the beginning to get into the sort of the sports aspect of the book, and I'm a big sports person, and it was it's on the cover, and for good reason, that this is a big part of the interest of the story. Can you just tell us about how Liesl discovered her sporting life, tennis in particular, but if there were other things that she was interested in, sort of her coming into sports?
Yeah. Well, when she was a child, she was really talented at the piano, and her father, who was quite a dominant parent, he said that she should practice the piano at all times. But he also bought her a tennis racket. But he said, you mustn't use this too much, because this would risk your fingers for piano playing. But so she only played a little. And then when she was older, she went to Paris, where she went and studied French and history of art at the Sorbonne University. And this is where she met my grandfather, as I mentioned. He was, as well as starting out in making stockings, that's the business he had when he went to Vienna. He also was vice president at the time of a big sporting club called Hakoah in Vienna. And Hakoah was the biggest sporting club in Europe at the time, possibly even in the world. And it had a lot of different sports that people could play there, either just for fun, or they took it pretty seriously. There was fencing, soccer, wrestling, swimming, athletics, skiing, tennis, of course. So she, when she met my grandfather, he had taken the soccer team to London to play a match against West Ham United, which was a big British team. And actually, Hakoah beat the team 5-0, which was unheard of. It was the first foreign team ever to beat a British team. So on the way home to celebrate.
Can I just interrupt you for a moment there? Because that's a fascinating piece of the story. That for Hakoah and that team that beat West Ham, which obviously it's a great win. How much of the Jewishness of the team was discussed, or was it seen as an Austrian team without any mention of Jewry? Like, how was the Jewishness of that discussed? Sorry, Felice, you're just frozen here for a moment.
Mhm. Let's see, Felice might be having some tech issues, so we're just gonna give her a second to come on back. Felice, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you want to try going out and coming back in, that might be what you need to do. Okay, so let's give her just a second. Thank you everyone so much for your patience, and Michael, thank you so much for
Oh, sure.
for
And
your
I don't
patience
know who,
as well.
there was just somebody put in the chat that Hakoah wore the Star of David on their uniforms. That's,
Oh wow,
did not know
thank you
that.
so much. Yeah, so everyone, we're just gonna give Felice a couple more seconds. Oh, here we go. All right.
Felice,
Felice,
you're
I
back.
think you're muted. All right, and you're back. Can you hear us?
Yeah,
Okay.
I
Um,
can.
okay.
So Felice, we were just talking about when the Hakoah team played West Ham, just how was their Jewishness expressed? Somebody said in the chat that they had a Star of David on their uniform, but I was just sort of curious if you know how their Jewish, like how much of the Jewishness was a part of the team in a visible public way.
Yes. Definitely, they, as you say, they had a Star of David on their uniform. Now, Hakoah was a club that was started, I think it was in 1909, and the reason for it was because Jewish people were not welcome in other sports clubs. So they thought, well, we'll start our own. And so that's what they did, and they did really, really well. And in fact, they sent a team of women swimmers to the Munich Olympics, the Hitler Olympics, and they they took part in all sorts of different matches and things in all different sports. But as the years went on, as in the 1930s, they began to receive a lot of bad treatment. And the sports team started to have to travel with the wrestling team as bodyguards, which was not great. But
and in Austria, and certainly with Felice and her tennis career, which we're going to talk about, but for the Hakoah athletes, the Hakoah teams, what was were they in Austria itself, as the Austrians considered the success of these teams? Was there among the Jewish Austrian population, was there a sense of visible or public support and pride in particular for it being both Austrian and Jewish, or more Jewish than Austrian, or more Austrian than Jewish? And then for the non-Jewish Austrians, did they take some relish in the fact that an Austrian team, albeit Jewish, beat West Ham? Can you talk a little bit about how the Jewishness of the Hakoah team was seen in Austria, if you know?
well, they also, yeah. Well, what I do know is they won the Austria League in soccer, so they were pretty well known. I'm not sure what Austrians themselves thought of it, but they must have respected them because they did really well. They were really good athletes, and one of the things my grandfather wanted to promote when he then became president, and he stayed president from 1928 to 1938 of the club, was to show that actually Jewish people could be good athletes. There'd been a lot of press really saying that Jewish people were all sort of bookish and not good at sports and not keen on that sort of thing, but this proved otherwise. And so there was I think it was well respected until, of course, Hitler came along,
Right.
when things
I mean,
changed.
I think about in the United States, there's the famous example of Sandy Koufax, who was the great pitcher in the late 1950s and early 1960s for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and then for the Los Angeles Dodgers when they moved to Los Angeles, and then how he famously didn't pitch in a World Series game because it fell on Yom Kippur. And certainly, like, it was before that I was born, obviously, but there was, I think, very much a sense in the Jewish population writ large in the United States, almost, I don't know if it's, whether you were religious or not, there was certainly a lot of pride in Koufax being Jewish. And I was just wondering when, probably wasn't, I don't know if it was to the same extent, but among Jews in Austria. And again, if you know this, as Liesl became more and more successful as a tennis player, and obviously she became champion in Austria, to what extent was her Jewishness even known or appreciated? Was it a thing in the Jewish community? To what extent was her Jewishness sort of wrapped up in the tennis and appreciated by the Jewish community is my question.
Well, it was known because her tennis coaches were coaches from Hakoah, and that's where she used to go and practice. And there were quite a few Jewish tennis players around at the time. A lot of the people she played in other countries. For instance, Helen Jacobs was one of the people she played doubles with from the USA. She was Jewish. And there was a British player as well, Angela Buxton at the time, and a couple of German players. So there were quite a few Jewish tennis players. Those are just the female ones I've mentioned. Sure. So yes, she was known to be a Jewish tennis player. But then when by about 1933, 1934, David, her husband, suggested that she should perhaps distance herself a bit from Hakoah because people were getting a bit funny about her entering tournaments and things like that. And by 1937, she wasn't invited to any tournaments anymore in Germany or Austria. She could only take part in tournaments in Switzerland, the south of France, and places like that.
Right. And what was, if you know, and if you could, obviously this is a totally different generation of tennis players, but could you, to the extent that you know, describe her as a tennis player? What was she like? Was she, you talk about it a little bit in the book, but if you could just sort of talk about her as an athlete and what her specialties were and how she won her matches and just what she was like as a player.
Okay, well, she used to really enjoy playing against men. And so whenever she was practicing, she liked to play men because she was determined, really determined. And she boasted to me that she could outrun anyone and that she had huge stamina. And my mother, who was also a tennis player, told me that actually her mother didn't have that much talent. It was really her stamina and her determination that she could just go on and on when other people were fading. And even I remember in my childhood, my grandmother used to train like an athlete. She had a skipping rope that she kept in her bedroom, and she used to skip well into her 80s. She skipped using this rope every morning, and she played golf almost till she died. She skied until her ski boots fell apart. So she was a very athletic woman.
Awesome. Well, why don't we change gears a little bit and go into the history of sort of more the history and the Holocaust history related to what happened in sort of 1938 with David, Liesl, and Orly, your mother, and then we'll go on to the other parts of the family as well. So if you could just sort of, obviously this is a big part of the book, and it's actually a very exciting part of the book. And needless to say, they survived. So that's sort of a positive part of the book. Mm-hmm. But if you could just take us through their journey from Austria and then making it through to England.
Yeah, well, they led a very good life in Vienna. So in their years there, they, very comfortable. My grandfather's business was doing well, and he really enjoyed being involved with Hakoah. And that was great until the 1930s and later in the 1930s. And by 1937, my grandfather realized it was time to go. And so he started preparing. He had a sister who was already living in London. So he kept in touch with her, and she said, well, you can come and, if you can get here, come and live here, till you get yourself sorted out. So he tried for visas because my grandmother really liked the idea of going to live in Portugal because of the sunshine, be a good place for playing tennis. But she didn't want to leave Vienna at all. And she couldn't understand why, she as a tennis player should be stopped from playing. She was quite a bit naive in that way, whereas my grandfather was very practical and he knew that they were in great danger. So first of all, wasn't until 1939 really that they left. The first thing that happened was that my grandmother got on a train with her tennis rackets, pretending that she was going to be playing matches. So she was still able to travel okay. She, I think, must have had false papers, because if anyone checked, there wasn't the big red J on her papers. So she managed to go to Prague, where she thought she'd be safe. And meanwhile, my mother, who was about 11 years old, she traveled separately, and she had a nanny, a governess, who took her to northern Bohemia for a while, and then separately on false papers, and then ended up in Prague, where she met up with my grandmother. Meanwhile, my grandfather wasn't so easy for him, because he was supposed to stay in Vienna and Aryanize his business for the Nazis. So that meant handing everything over, doing all the paperwork, all the books, and basically giving them the key to his business. And his business by then, with his brother as partner, was very, very successful. They had a factory in Berlin and big offices in Vienna. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to leave everything behind, but he had no choice. And he also had to get the club ready, the Hakoah Club, where he was president, because that had a lot of that had a stadium, a sports stadium, an athletics track. It had tennis courts. It was a big concern, and the Nazis wanted that too. So he had to get that ready for them. But then he realized that if he actually finished the work, they would throw him in prison, and that prison was Dachau. And so he thought, actually, I'm going to have to go as well and not finish the work. So what he did was he got to the station in Vienna. His office manager, who was a man who was was married to a Catholic woman, so he was sort of okay at that time. He in fact spent the whole of the war in Vienna. But he took my grandfather to the station in the middle of the night, and my grandfather got on a train and went across part of Austria to close to the Czech border, where he then met up with a smuggler that he'd hired. And with another group of people, they went in a little boat along the river, which got them across the border into Moravia, which was part of Czechoslovakia, and to safety, or so he thought. And then he managed to get to Prague, met up with my grandmother and my mother and the rest of the family, the extended family. So my grandmother's two sisters, one sister had a husband and a teenage daughter, and my grandmother's elderly mother. They all met up in Prague. And from there, my grandfather tried to get visas, onward visas for Portugal.
Just one second, just sort of one historical note. So the war starts September 1st, 1939. So this is before the Second World War has actually started, but the Germans are very much around and in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, this was in January, February of that year.
39.
Yeah, so they were in Prague and trying to get visas, onward visas, which they failed. So they tried to go to Portugal, they tried to go to Australia, and then finally they managed to get two visas just for my mother and my grandmother to go to Britain. So they were very relieved about that, but they didn't want to go because my grandfather didn't have a visa. He said, the important thing is if you go, I'll get there, don't worry. So they did manage to get a flight to England, and my grandfather yet again had to hire a smuggler.
And then
this
when
time
they got to England, when they got to England, then they stayed with your
my
grandfather's sister.
Yeah,
okay,
in North London. And so meanwhile, my grandfather again had to go with a smuggler. This time he had to crawl on his stomach for 18 miles through the snow across the border into Poland. And he was always one step ahead because the Germans were waiting on the border each time, but they hadn't quite got to Poland yet. So he thought he was safe there for the time being. And he borrowed some money from a friend, a business associate in Poland, and got across Poland after, having a very, very harrowing journey through the snow, through the mountains. He managed to get into Poland and got himself to Warsaw, where with the money he borrowed, he and 12 other Jewish people, Polish mainly, chartered a flight to get to Britain. And so he got on his flight and he got to Britain and met, my grandmother was waiting at the other end. But of course, the British didn't want people arriving. They didn't want this number of people arriving. They were not very keen on it at all. And they were sending people back. 400 people arrived the same day as my grandfather in March. And he managed to stay because he could prove he had a sister who lived in London who would give them, a home. And he also had forwarded some money. He was always very forward thinking. He'd managed to forward £50, which doesn't seem like much money today, but it was quite a lot then, per person, which proved to the British that they were able to finance, they wouldn't be a burden on society. So, they managed to get temporary visas, only just temporary. And the other people on the flight were threatened with being sent back. And one man said that he'd jump out of the plane. And there was a terrible sort of commotion with people crying and not able to stay. But in the end, they were all allowed to stay temporarily, at least. Meanwhile, of course, the rest of the family was still in Prague.
Sure. So why don't we, so we, just to make sure that everybody's on the same, that you're, at this point, your grandmother, grandfather, and your mother are safe in England. And now let's go back to just what you were about to do. I apologize. We're going to talk about the rest of Liesl's family who were left behind. And so please go ahead. And it's again, I think you're doing a really good job at telling us the story. Tell what you want. It's a big part of the book also. So I don't want you to necessarily do too much because the book is really worth reading all of it. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to give away the whole story, but right. My grandmother's two sisters, they stayed in Prague, and one of them, the older one, Trudy, she and her husband and daughter thought that they tried to get visas to go to Australia, but failed. So then they thought they'll go to a small village in Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, but in that part of Czechoslovakia, where they thought that no one would notice them. They could stay there and live quietly. But of course, they were wrong. They were in the middle of the night, Nazi. It was actually the Hlinka Guard, they were called, which was Nazi sympathizers in Czechoslovakia. And they came and took them away and took them into prison, into a labor camp called Novaki, which is not very well known, but it was a place where a lot of people were then sent on to to decimation camps. But at Novaki, they were just worked really, really hard, and they stayed there for 2 years. And then, amazingly, the sort of the resistance was planning an uprising in Slovakia against the Nazis. And not many people know about this, but it was called the Slovak National Uprising, where a mixture of Jewish people and partisans basically fought back. So what happened is that the partisans opened the doors to the camp and another 2 camps as well, gave people guns, let them out, and let them fight if they could, or at least hide, or release them from the camp to fight back. So that's what they did, but it didn't all end very well. But they did have a chance, and there was hope that they could fight back and be free. And it was getting to the end of the war at that stage. But you can find out more about that in my book itself.
Of course,
there's another sister as well.
Correct, and then there's your Liesl's other sister.
Yeah. The other sister who was disabled, she and her mother, who was actually only 64, but in those days that was considered elderly, they were taken to Theresienstadt, which is today called Terezin, which was a camp where they let people die of disease and overcrowding, basically. It wasn't like Auschwitz, where they had gas and things like that, but it was a sort of staging post before sending them on to Auschwitz. And lots and lots of people, including my family, died of disease because not enough food, they had to work, overcrowding. And this camp specialized in people that were elderly, disabled, and also famous people. So writers and people like that, artists were
Right.
sent there.
So I think that tells a lot of both the story of the main characters in the book, and also gives a great history. Obviously, these characters were part of the whole history that we know a lot about. So I think in the last sort of 10 minutes that I have, or 10, 15 minutes before we hand it over to some audience questions, I want to talk about what it was like for you to go through this process of learning so much about your family, how it all started, why it all started, just sort of what it meant to you to go about this process.
Okay, well, my mother really suffered from trauma after what had happened to her. She was 12 years old by the time she arrived in Britain. She didn't speak any English. She suddenly had to leave all her school friends behind, everyone and everything she knew, and start again. And she never really got over that. And my grandmother, again, being torn away from tennis and her fame in Vienna and her good life there. And then she felt terribly guilty about her family. She felt she hadn't tried hard enough to get them to come with her, especially her mother and disabled sister. So she felt survivor's guilt. And because she survived and others didn't in her close family. My grandfather was much more grounded, and he had quite a few, he was one of 11 brothers and sisters, and quite a few of them made it. They sort of escaped to different countries, one to Mexico, one to Australia, one to Israel, and others to London. But what happened was that my mother in particular sort of set up a sort of denial of the past. She brought me up telling me that do not tell anyone that you are Jewish. That was her main thing. She said, look what happened to me. I don't want this to happen again. I don't want this to happen to you. And I didn't know any better. I didn't know to question it. But I was brought up basically without any religion at all. And I knew that I had Jewish roots. I knew I had a Jewish mother, but I wasn't allowed to talk about it. I wasn't allowed to ask questions about it. And I heard a lot of stories from my grandparents about their childhoods, lovely childhoods, my grandmother's in particular, but not many stories about their time, immediately before, once the Nazis were in Austria. And they were very quiet about it all. They also brought me up without knowing any German at all. They rejected the language. I mean, they spoke it among themselves because when they arrived, my grandmother knew a bit of English, but my grandfather didn't know any at all. So, yeah, there was a lot of denial about the past.
I definitely want to talk a little bit more about that, but just for you personally, like, here you go, you went about this whole process of writing a whole book. So I guess, I get the idea that you were brought up not being allowed, or not your parents, your mother not wanting to talk about it, which probably piqued your interest somewhat. But just what was the aha moment? What was the sort of got you inspired to write this book? Like what got you fired up to do this?
Well, it was my daughter who was a student at the time, and she said to me, we don't know anything about our Austrian background, our Jewish heritage. You never talk about it. And I said, well, the thing is, I don't know very much about it. And she said, well, why don't we go to Vienna and have a look, see what we can find? And she opened her laptop and she showed me some cheap flights. And she said, look, we can go next month. And I thought about it. And then I decided, yeah, that's a good idea. So I bought flights for myself and my 3 kids. My husband stayed at home to look after our dogs. And off we went to Vienna. And the first thing I did was book a Jewish walking tour of the city to sort of walk through the Leopoldstadt and the the Jewish area of Vienna. And it was really, that's where my journey began, really, because I knew nothing about it. I'd never set foot inside a synagogue even, because I'd been so sort of, my mother had denied the whole thing. So on this walking tour, the guide said to me, by the way, I love helping people with researching their families, particularly if they came from Vienna. And I said, oh, that sounds great. She said, well, when you get home back to England, email me with anything you know, the names of your family, any addresses, any dates of birth, whatever you know, send that to me and I will do the rest. Because, of course, I don't speak German. And she was Austrian. And I did this. A few weeks later, along came the most amazing amount of information. She'd looked in the archives and it was incredible what I knew. And I didn't even know that my grandmother had this second sister because she'd never mentioned the one she probably felt most guilty about, Irma, the disabled sister. She was never mentioned. I now knew of her existence. And then Barbara, the Austrian woman who was so helpful, then said, the next thing you must do is get in touch with the Jewish Museum in Prague, because that's where your grandmother came from. They both came from Czechoslovakia. That's the next step for you. So I then got in hold of someone there and on it went. And then I decided to go to all these places. So I went to Prague. I found out that the name of the house where my grandmother was born and also where my grandfather was born. So I did a sort of tour over 2 years, visiting all these small places and visiting the places where people were born and where they were killed. I didn't know any of this before. And I probably know more than my grandparents even knew, more detail because of the internet, which obviously didn't exist. It was just beginning in their lifetime. And I was able to do so much research because the Nazis, one of the things they did was they kept meticulous details of everything. And so I know from in Theresienstadt, I know the minute and the hour of my great-grandmother's death, how she died. I know that she was on the following week, she was on the list to go to Auschwitz. My grandmother wouldn't have known any of these things because she wouldn't have known to do the research, and there was no internet. There was no way of, going to find out these things. The archives, probably wouldn't have been as good then. Even though this information existed, it was probably hard to get hold of it.
Right. My brother and I and our families have gone through sort of some similar processes of learning about our pasts. And all the time we meet people who know a lot more about us than we do. And it's always a little bit weird when somebody comes up to you and says, I know this, this, and this. And you're just like, really? I had no idea. And so it's, but I know on my own journey, it seems a little bit similar to yours, is that, you get one piece of information and that leads you to another piece. And it is a fascinating puzzle, and to then appreciate that one is a part of that through dint of birth. It's not because you did anything other than get born to these people. It really is, it's very moving and obviously important. And then it sort of fixes one in this both familiar history and then in a broader scope, of course, within the whole world of the Holocaust. So it's if I wanted to go back to your grandmother, and one of the things about survivors is that everybody is different. Your where you grew up, like you were talking about between your grandfather and your grandmother, people grew up differently. Religious, not religious, money, not money, family problems, not family problems, hard life, a relatively easy life. And then people went through very different experiences, all of them awful, but even within the awfulness, there were certainly gradations of awfulness. And then I think the final piece is that, people have their own personalities. People are who they are. And when you mix all that up, there's no one Holocaust survivor. And So I guess my question is, when you think about your mother, when you think about your grandmother, and I'm going to ask you this about your mother as well, what was, I guess, what was she like that you know about before all the bad stuff happened? And then what was she like afterwards? And you touched on a little bit about the Survivor Guild, but how was sort of this differences, what were some manifestations of the experience during the war that then carried over after the war?
Hmm. Well, all the early photos of my grandmother, and I have about 12 photo albums of hers, and I've had to guess that she left them with a friend in Vienna. That's how she managed to save them. But she always looked happy and smiling. And when I knew her, she never really looked happy, although she was determined always. And we haven't really touched on her tennis very much
Sorry
because
about that. Yes.
she played at Wimbledon, so she was
Sorry.
absolutely determined. And but I don't think she was ever truly happy again, and my mother definitely wasn't either. And what they did do, which my grandmother loved, was that they played at Wimbledon together, and they were the only mother and daughter ever to have played doubles together at Wimbledon. And that record stays today, because my grandmother was in her 40s by then, so it wouldn't be possible. But my grandmother,
I'm sorry I didn't touch on that
determination.
more, because obviously it's in the title of the book.
Yeah.
It really
So
does
yeah, that was
an astonishingly great experience for the both of them, and accomplishment. And so your mother was also then a decent, more than a decent tennis player.
Yeah, my mother was actually a better tennis player than my grandmother, in that she had more opportunities to play in the UK, and she played at Wimbledon, I think 5 years running, and she also played in the US Open. Now, she didn't get that far, and nor my grandmother. In fact, when my grandmother got to the UK in 1939, she'd never played on a grass court before, but she was determined to play at Wimbledon. So she joined a club called the Queen's Club in London, which is a well-known club, where she played on grass for the first time. And then she had to qualify for Wimbledon by beating 3 other women, which she did. And one of the women she beat was the grandmother of a very famous British tennis player called Tim Henman.
Sure.
So she beat his grandmother to play at Wimbledon. But then she didn't get that far in Wimbledon, because not only had she not played tennis for 2 years because of what was happening in mainland Europe, but she hadn't played on grass. And then after that, there was no tennis during World War II anyway, because Wimbledon closed and became more of a farm with chickens and goats and sheep. And then she played it was after the war that she played doubles with my mother.
Well, I think maybe we should stop on that sort of really wonderful idea of your grandmother and your mother playing together at Wimbledon. I mean, it's a sensational accomplishment. Again, I apologize for not, we talked about tennis earlier, and I should have obviously gotten to that point, but thank you so much for getting us there in the end. And like I said, congratulations on the book. It is available for purchase now on Amazon. Sydney is going to send out a link as well. I can't recommend it highly enough. Everybody should buy the book. Felice did a great job describing a lot of it, but like I said, there is just exciting stuff in it, awful stuff in it. It's compelling and a really good read. So Felice, congratulations on your book. And Sydney, I'd like to give it back to you so that then you can take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. And
Thank you.
I also want to echo what Michael said, and I encourage you all to read Felice's book. And the link is in the chat, and I will put it in the chat again at the end. And Michael, I want to thank you for such a really thoughtful interview that you did today before we move on to audience questions. So the first question that we got is how do you feel that your grandmother, and I'm also going to extend it to your mother, how do you feel that her tennis career and kind of the skill set needed for tennis also equipped her sort of for survival in a way, and for, kind of going, doing what she needed to do during the war in order to survive?
That's a great question. No one's asked me that before. I think I said that my grandmother was a very determined woman, and she was always very fit. She kept fit and very athletic. So her determination really helped. But the driving force behind it was my grandfather, really, because he was always one step ahead, whether it was in business, whether it was, he always knew what was going on. He, as a child, he bought me my first ever computer. He bought me my first ever Beatles record. He was always ahead. And so he will have been the driving force behind my grandmother and mother.
That's amazing. And you know, we've mentioned Wimbledon a bit, but so you mentioned that Wimbledon, at Wimbledon, your grandmother and your mother are the only mother-daughter to have played doubles there. Has Wimbledon given recognition to this, and like how widely is that known to those who play at Wimbledon and sort of in tennis history in general?
No, because it's in ancient history now, really. But when I did my research, I went to the Wimbledon Museum and Archives, and the person in charge of all of that showed me books and books full of all their results, and he was the one that told me that they were the only mother and daughter ever to have played doubles, and that he doubted that record would ever be beaten because of such different ages. You wouldn't normally get a 20-year-old playing with a 40-year-old, and yeah, so they do know that they did something special.
That's amazing. And I think this echoes an earlier question that Michael asked, but kind of after the war. So when your grandmother and your mother were playing at Wimbledon and in the US Open, was there any negative or positive effects for them being Jewish? And also were they still open about being Jewish at that point? Was it known that they were Jewish tennis players?
After the war.
After the war.
Well, the first thing that was when my grandmother played, she didn't have Austrian nationality anymore. That was taken away from her. So she played, she was a player from Moravia. And they did manage to get naturalization and become British later on in the 1940s. But they never mentioned any problems about anti-Semitism once, after the war. Although I do know that if they had been known to be Austrian, they might have been interned in the Isle of Man, because a lot of people, that happened to Austrians and Germans. But I think because they were Czechoslovakian officially, therefore they weren't. So they were lucky that didn't happen to them. But it was difficult because they didn't speak. My grandmother spoke a bit of English. My mother went straight to school, where she was bullied at school because of being German speaking, because children didn't differentiate between someone Jewish who'd had to escape or someone German who they were fighting against, who was the enemy in the war. So, she had a difficult time at school.
Thank you. And just because you mentioned the Isle of Man, I'm putting in the chat a program that we did about that internment camp on the Isle of Man. So I recommend that you all check that out as well if you want to learn more about that. I don't know if you, in that at the beginning when you were kind of talking about the players that the other Jewish players that your grandmother had played, we have a specific question about Angela Buxton, who was the British Jewish doubles partner of Althea Gibson, who's now getting some interest. Do you know if she ever played either Althea Gibson or Angela Buxton? I know that's very specific, so if you don't know.
No, I don't know. There are a lot of tennis results in my book, at the back of the book. So if anyone wants to get the book and have a look, you'll find out there. But I don't remember seeing their names there. But yeah, the only ones I know she definitely played against were Helen Jacobs from the USA, and then there was a player called Nelly Nepak from Germany who she played as well. And when she was expelled from her tennis club in 1933, she killed herself. So that was awful.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I would again would encourage you all to get more of this information in the book. So you kind of talked about the role that sport played a bit later in your grandmother's life and how she kept active and was still doing things into her 80s, which is amazing. What did sport sort of continue to play a role in your mother's life after, especially after Wimbledon? Did she continue to play? Did she stay active? What role did that play?
Yeah, she did. She played 5 Wimbledons, but then after that, she got married and she gave up tennis. I don't think she'd ever been that keen. I think she'd been pushed by her mother. I spoke to just today. I spoke for the first time in many, many years to a lovely woman who was my mother's best friend, who we've only just found each other, and she told me that my mother felt she wasn't really that good at tennis, that she wasn't good enough. Her mother felt she wasn't good enough, and that it was really her mother's game, my grandmother, not my mother's. So my mother's real game, her love was golf, not tennis.
Oh, okay.
And also skiing, because the place that my grandfather came from was, I mean, he didn't ski. He was too poor to do anything like that. But my grandmother went skiing as a child. And so skiing has been very much in our family. That's our real sport. And I unfortunately didn't inherit any tennis talent at all from my grandmother or mother. But skiing is the love that I inherited from them.
That's amazing. And so you also talked about how your daughter is kind of was the catalyst for this book and for your research. So how has writing this book, both impacted you, but also, your children? Was there a lot of surprise there? Like what has sort of been the result of that for your family?
They've been really, really supportive. It's been great, and they're fascinated by it. 2 out of 3 of my children have read the book so far. My one son is not. He's a slow reader. He's not reading, he prefers computers and things like that. But they've been to 2 out of 3 of them have been to Prague with me, where we laid stepping stones for my grandmother's family. They have these, they're called Stolpersteine in German. It's a German artist who does this. And you can, in memory of family members who were killed in the Holocaust, you can have these bronze stones laid in the pavement. So we went and did this in Prague, and 2 of my children and my niece came along for that. And then we've also all been to Israel together, to Yad Vashem, and they're really, really involved in it now. Yes.
That's amazing. And so, we are coming to the end of our time. So I do want to ask you, what are you hoping that people get from reading the book? Like what is, like, if you had to boil it down, which I know is kind of difficult, what is the lesson that you hope people walk away with?
Okay, well, one of the things I feel really strongly about is that people must tell their stories. So the older generation must pass down their stories to their families. It's really, really important. It would be so sad if people's stories are lost. I know that there are not many actual Holocaust survivors left, and I'm really sad and a bit frightened about that too, because I think these stories need to go on. And then the other thing is that the other way around, that young people must ask their family for stories too. And I wish I'd asked my mother and my grandparents more. I wish I'd insisted. But, when you're a child, you don't think, you're not that interested. That's the trouble. And then when you're a teenager as well. But, if you get the chance, if you're younger, please write things down. Maybe record your older family member giving you some of them, telling you about their memories. It's so important, I think. Even it doesn't have to be published into a book. It could be made into a book just for your family, or maybe never made into a book at all, but it should be there. It should be recorded for your family and for history, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think that is all the questions we have from the audience. So I want to thank both of you, Michael and Felice. And if you have any other kind of concluding statements either of you want to make, now's the time. But if not, we'll wrap up.
Just one more big thanks to Felice for writing the book. I couldn't agree with you more about the getting your parents and everybody else to talk if they will. And again, congratulations. And it's a great read.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Well, I want to thank you both again, and thank you for taking the time to be here with us. And you can buy The Tennis Champion Who Escaped the Nazis at the link in the chat. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience who joined us today. And if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. Next, we have a discussion of the book In the Garden of the Righteous tomorrow, and the history of anti-Semitism, the Crusades, next Wednesday. You can watch past programs and view and share today's recording, which is going to be available later this week on our YouTube channel. Felice, Michael, thank you both so much again. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Have a great afternoon / evening, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.